Susan B. Anthony's determination to establish equality among sexes was the foundation of the beliefs of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, whose actions sparked the women's suffrage movement in the United States. Following Anthony's death, the actions of both her and the association directly led to the ratification of the 19th Amendment, therefore legalizing the right for women to vote. Her then controversial ideology that women should have equal rights to men has survived over a century, and women still continue to fight for their rights today.
On January 8, 1868, Anthony's lifelong dream of having her own newspaper, The Revolution, dedicated to women's rights was fulfilled. Funded by George Francis Train, The Revolution was distributed to the Rochester general public and brought to light the unjust inequalities between men and women during this time period. This newspaper was instrumental in the spread of the women's rights movement to working-class women. By talking about issues such as unequal pay for women, unionization, and discrimination in the workplace, The Revolution attracted a wider audience than other papers at the time. Although the paper was shut down in 1872 because of lack of funding, it persuaded many women into joining the movement due to its unique point of view. Furthermore, Anthony made a deal with the University of Rochester. If she raised $50,000 for the university, they would ensure the admittance of women into their school. When she fell short of her goal, Anthony donated the cash value of her life insurance policy. With this contribution, Anthony made the deadline, and therefore women were admitted into the university. In addition to her newspaper and generous contributions to the women at the University of Rochester, Anthony individually lobbied for women's suffrage at various state legislatures. She created multiple petitions to the United States Congress to allow women the right to vote. Although Anthony only lived to see some of her ideas put into everyday society, many of her beliefs were carried on by women inspired by her influence.
On November 5, 1872, Susan B. Anthony illegally voted in the presidential election, making her the first woman to vote in the United States. Shortly after, Anthony was arrested, tried, and fined $100 for her violation of federal law. A year later, Anthony made a speech addressed to the citizens of Rochester where she criticized her arrest by saying it was a violation of her constitutional rights. After quoting the preamble of the Constitution, Anthony said, "It was we the people, not we the white male citizens, nor yet we the male citizens, but we the whole people who formed the Union. And we formed it not to give the blessings of liberty, but to secure them, not to the half of ourselves and the half of our posterity, but to the whole people, women as well as men. And it is a downright mockery to talk of women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty, while they are denied the use of the only means of securing them provided by the Democratic Republican government, the ballot." When Susan B. Anthony made this speech, she was arguing that the Constitution promises equal rights for all people, not just the white males in society. By denying women the right to vote, the United States government is contradicting the claims made in the Constitution. This unjust inequality leads to the power imbalance in everyday life and causes women to be controlled by all white male citizens, regardless of their merit.
In 1890, with the help of her friends Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Julia Ward Howe, and Lucy Stone, Anthony started the National American Women's Suffrage Association. This group was a combination of two suffrage groups at the time, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association. The National Women's Suffrage Association was focused on creating a constitutional amendment allowing women to vote in national elections. The American Women's Suffrage Association worked on getting state laws reformed. The groups decided to combine their organizations to appeal to a bigger group of people. Despite their rallying support for the suffragettes, there were groups who did not support the NAWSA's beliefs. There were a number of anti-woman suffrage groups at the time who believed that women are emotional beings and therefore are not mentally sound enough to make informed decisions about how the country is governed. These groups believed that women simply did not deserve the right to vote and that it was unnecessary because they are already represented by their husbands. The National American Women's Suffrage Association led protests in Washington and around the country to recruit more people for their cause. The then President Woodrow Wilson was aware of the suffragettes but did not support the movement until 1918, when he saw that women who were being arrested for picketing were being force-fed and treated horribly in prisons. This picture captures the spirit of suffragettes and how they were so passionate about women's rights that they protested outside the White House and risked getting arrested.
After the death of Susan B. Anthony in 1906, the efforts of the National American Women's Suffrage Association became more centered around the creation of a constitutional amendment. The association proposed a bill to Congress that would ensure women the right to vote. In 1916, all the suffragist associations were avidly supporting the constitutional amendment. During the years 1917 and 1918, both New York State and President Wilson had changed their positions to support the movement. Directly resulting from this change in position, the politics in Washington had begun to shift as well. A year later, on May 21, 1919, the House of Representatives passed a suggested amendment, which was closely followed by the Senate's approval. On August 18, 1920, Tennessee was the 36th state to ratify the amendment. The amendment was then passed on to Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby, who certified the ratification on August 26, 1920, making the amendment active. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. The amendment therefore gives every citizen of the U.S. the full legislation to vote and fulfills the goals of Anthony and the National American Woman Suffrage Association." As a result of the ratification of the amendment, an increased number of people were able to vote, making the government a more accurate representation of the public's voice. In addition to giving women a voice in the government, women were also starting to get more involved in the government and began to have a stronger presence.
So Susan B. Anthony really worked towards women, white women in particular, being able to get the vote in 1920. Later, there were movements that really made sure that that was universal suffrage in the United States. So people, across all sorts of race and socioeconomic categories can vote today in the U.S. So whenever we have the chance to vote, we're exercising the right that she worked really hard towards.
Following the ratification of the 19th Amendment, Susan B. Anthony began to gain more recognition across the United States for her role in the creation of this amendment. In 1936, a stamp was issued to commemorate Susan B. Anthony and all of her hard work fighting for women's suffrage. In 1978, Susan B. Anthony was honored as the first woman to ever have her likeness on a United States coin. Although this coin was produced 70 years after Anthony's death, it shows what a lasting legacy she left behind on this country.
Women and men today in the United States, but also elsewhere, are indebted to Susan B. Anthony and her colleagues, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Amelia Bloomer, and others, for the work they did, which at the time was explicitly oriented towards women's rights, towards labor rights, towards anti-slavery, but today have effects in our daily life. For instance, while we still have battles for making sure that girls, for instance, can get a technical education and are offered the opportunities to become an engineer or a physicist, we wouldn't even be having that conversation if it wasn't for Susan B. Anthony and her friends, because there were certain things that weren't even within the realm of the possible in the 1800s. And they really made those things seem possible and made room for girls to even go to universities. Susan B. Anthony was able to convince the University of Rochester to admit women. So there's a lot of work they did early on that allows us to have, we're continuing the conversation, but it's a more subtle, we're not battling to say let women into universities. We're instead battling to say let's make sure to support women in universities, to let women see the huge range of possible careers. The conversation's very different today, but at least we're not saying women should even be allowed to go to school. When I think about the efforts we have towards improving women's rights today, I think the thing that I would most hope for is that people would even realize there are problems. Because I so often I hear this from college students, I hear from high school students, I hear from friends of mine who are my age, like, we don't have to argue for women's rights anymore. We don't experience any forms of discrimination as women today. And it's so not true.
Susan B. Anthony's work in women's rights was highly disputed during her time, but her brave actions to stand up for her rights as an American woman paved the way to significant changes for women everywhere. Although she never lived to see what her hard work accomplished, her legacy still remains intact. Her involvement in the National American Woman Suffrage Association was invaluable, and her contributions to society have a great impact on the United States today.